I never imagined that standing under the warm glow of the ballroom chandeliers, my heart pounding like a drum, could feel so bittersweet. My name is Emily, I'm 35, and tonight I wore the slate grey sheath dress I'd agonized over. All week, the dress hugged my curves just right, the neckline modest, the fabric soft against my skin. It was a surprisingly cool April evening in Chicago, the wind whispering through the hotel's revolving doors as guests streamed inside. I'd spent the last 6 months planning this celebration for my husband's marketing firm, budgeting, sourcing florals, coordinating catering, and everyone knew it. Yet, when he took the stage to thank me, it felt like a spotlight revealing far more than my professional pride. I watched as his colleagues applauded, their faces cheerful beneath the soft amber light. I forced a smile as he spoke. I couldn't have done this without Emily, her vision, her tenacity. She's the backbone of this event. My cheeks warmed, pride and anxiety warring inside me. I glanced at him, tall, dark-haired, impeccably dressed in an navy soutane, felt that familiar pang of love and fear. Love because he'd acknowledged me in front of everyone. Fear because I knew the truth he hadn't spoken, the secret that shadowed our marriage. The betrayal that lingered like perfume on his collar died as the applause faded. I rose from my seat. At the head table, smoothing my dress, I hadn't planned to say anything. Etiquette said nod, smile, accept graciously. But gratitude turned to resolve in my chest. I walked to the podium, the microphones catching the faint rustle of my dress. Faces turned, chatter hushed. The floral arrangements at the center of each table, peonies and eucalyptus, scented the air, a reminder of the care I'd poured into every detail. My voice, when it came, was steady but cold. Thank you, everyone, for your applause. And, thank you, honey, for the kind words. I paused. The air felt thick. The orchestra in the corner tinkled a chord, as if holding its breath. My husband's eyes widened. I met his gaze, and in that moment, I saw the brief flicker of panic recognition that this wasn't the ending he'd rehearsed. I'm proud of what we've created together, I continued, but I'd be remiss if I didn't acknowledge all the support I received. Polite smiles morphed into curious glances. They wondered what twist awaited. So, I said, leaning into the silence, let me also thank the other woman who helped me learn to stand up for myself. A collective intake of breath rippled through the room. My husband's face drained of color, his lips parted as though to speak, then closed again. The floral scent seemed to turn sour in my nostrils. I saw the firm handshake freeze midair, watched the CFO drop his champagne flute with a clink. The bartender paused, cocktail shaker in hand. Everyone looked at us, the newlyweds no one questioned. Waiting for explanation, my pulse hammered in my ears, but my voice remained clear. You see, I asked her for guidance when I felt broken, lost. She told me I deserved better than being someone's secret. Gasps rose like a tide. My mother-in-law, seated at the next table, looked scandalized, her pearl necklace trembling. The young intern to my right paled. I could feel their judgment, but something in me loosened an exhilaration that came from confronting the lie. My husband opened his mouth, lips trembling. I held up a single finger, shushing the room more effectively than any microphone could. Let me finish, I said. The chandelier lights glinted off the crystal glasses as I stared him down. I don't know what I'd have done without her. She showed me the truth about you. I saw him sink into himself, his jaw clenching. The guests leaned forward. Anticipation crackled. Outside, the wind rattled the grand windows, carrying the faint hum of traffic on Michigan Avenue. It was as if the city itself waited for what came next. I swallowed the lump in my throat, recalling the endless nights I'd spent crying into my pillow, the whisper of his phone at odd hours, the perfume. That wasn't mine. I remembered calling a stranger his mistress, a woman named Rachel, begging for answers. She didn't hesitate. She told me everything. The late-night dinners, the weekend getaways, the promises he'd made that weren't promises at all. I let a beat pass, letting the silence deepen. The only sound was the soft hum of the hotel's air conditioning. Then, I nodded toward my husband. I want to thank her for giving me the courage to leave behind my fear. To demand respect, to stand here, unafraid. Faces went from shock to awe. Phones emerged as people recorded, their screens glowing in the dim light. I felt the weight of that moment pressing on me, both terrifying and liberating. I could feel my mother's disapproving stare from across the room, but I refused to. "Look away. I know some of you might think this is unorthodox," I said, voice unwavering. "But I choose honesty. I choose empowerment." I stepped back from the podium, my heart racing, and sank into the nearest chair. The moment stretched endless, potent. My husband didn't move. No one applauded. No one interrupted. The room buzzed with tension. But, for the first time in months, I felt alive. A low murmur began as guests traded glances, whispers of disbelief and admiration threading through the crowd. The chandelier light refracted in the tears at the corner of my eyes, but I refused to blink them away. Chicago's skyline was visible through the tall windows, towering buildings lit against the deepening night. I realized that tonight, this anniversary celebration would be remembered not for its floral arrangements or gourmet menu, but for the moment I reclaimed my voice. When I looked at him again, his eyes were red-rimmed, the carefully constructed facade crumbling. I felt a surge of compassion, not for the cheating husband he'd been, but for the man I still loved, hurting beneath the guilt. I straightened my shoulders and stood, ready to face what came next. The music from the orchestra began again, hesitant at first, then swelling with purpose. And in that uncertain, electric silence, I understood that this was only the beginning. The hush that followed my words felt heavier than any applause I'd ever received. My husband's shoulders slumped as he lifted his glass in a trembling salute, eyes darting around the ballroom as though searching for an exit. I sat still, my hands folded in my lap, heart pounding against the fabric of my dress. Above me, the chandeliers burned bright, but the warmth had drained from their light. My breaths came shallow and rapid as I tried to steady the storm in my chest. In that charged silence, I realized that nothing in my life would ever be the same. Slowly, the first tentative claps began, uncertain, half-hearted. They rippled through the room, as if the guests weren't sure whether they'd witness triumph or scandal. A few of his colleagues exchanged awkward smiles. Others whispered behind their hands. I watched them closely, curious which side of history each would choose. My mother's sharp intake of breath reached me from across the table, and I forced myself not to flinch. The path I'd chosen was not meant for waivers. I'd stood up for myself, and no amount of social discomfort could erase that truth. My husband rose and crossed the distance between us with slow, measured steps. His navy suit hung on him limply, as though it, too, had lost its shape under the weight of exposure. He lowered himself onto the chair beside me, gaze fixed on his fingertips. "Emily," he whispered, voice low and uneven. I felt a tremor run through me at the sound of my name, both intimate and foreign on his lips. I turned to meet his eyes, uncertain whether I wanted compassion or confrontation. He reached for my hand, but I pulled back gently. "Why?" I asked, not angrily, but with a hollow ache that cut deeper than any shout. He swallowed. "I'm sorry," he said. The words felt inadequate, as though sorry could stitch together the ripped seams of trust. "I never meant to hurt you." His apology hung between us, fragile and uncertain. I studied his face, lines of regret and fear traced around his eyes, but I knew that regret alone could never undo betrayal. I thought of Rachel, the woman whose existence had once felt like a knife against my heart. The stranger who became my confidant, teaching me that I deserved honesty and respect. How she had answered my trembling phone calls at 3 in the morning. How she had shared details that shattered my illusions. And how she'd inspired me, not to vanish into silent pain but to claim my voice. Without her brutal generosity, I might still be drowning in self-doubt. I pressed my lips together, remembering her kindness, her fierce advocacy for my well-being. As the final notes of the orchestra drifted through the air, I stood again. The guests turned with expectant faces. I drew a breath and spoke clearly. "I've decided that tonight, I'm leaving this celebration and this marriage behind." A collective exhale swept the room as disbelief dawned on them. Some shook their heads, others held their breath. My heart pounded, but this time with certainty. I was no longer the woman who'd mask her pain to keep the peace. I was choosing freedom. Without waiting for a reaction, I grabbed my clutch and walked toward the grand doors. The wind from Michigan Avenue greeted me with a cool slap, carrying the distant hum of sirens and city life. I paused on the threshold, glanced back at the haloed interior, and felt a bittersweet surge of pride. My husband remained seated at the head table, shoulders hunched. I didn't look at him again. Instead, I stepped into the night, letting the door close with deliberate finality. The taxi ride home was a blur of wet streets and neon reflections. My phone buzzed with missed calls, texts begging me to come back. I ignored them all. By the time I reached my apartment, the city had fallen into a lull, punctuated by the occasional screech of a train overhead. Inside, I sank onto my cream sofa, wrapping a cashmere throw around my shoulders. The adrenaline ebbed, leaving behind an ache that was both sorrowful and strangely liberating. I dialed Rachel's number without hesitation. On the first ring, she answered. "I knew you would," she said quietly. Her voice was calm, steady, the anchor I needed. We spoke for hours, sharing tears, laughter, and plans for the days ahead. She reminded me of my strengths, resilience, intelligence, compassion. By the end of the call, I felt fortified, ready to rebuild my life on my own terms. In that moment, I understood that sometimes the greatest love story is the one you have with yourself. As dawn crept through my curtains, I reflected on the choices before me. The journey would not be easy. Financial uncertainties, emotional setbacks, the whispers of society, but I felt anchored by a truth I'd fought hard to claim. I would face each obstacle with the same courage that carried me to the podium the night before. And when the time was right, I would write the final chapter of this story, one defined not by betrayal but by the triumph of standing tall. This was only part to the turning point where I reclaimed my narrative. Part 3 awaited, and I could hardly wait to begin. I woke to sunlight slicing through my blinds in slanted yellow bars, dust motes dancing in the warmth. The apartment was quiet except for the soft hum of the refrigerator and the distant rumble of the L overhead. I stretched beneath my cashmere throw and felt a curious blend of exhaustion and exhilaration. Last night's decision felt both impossibly recent and irrevocably distant, like I'd crossed a threshold in the dark and only now realized I was on uncharted ground. I ran my fingers through my hair, traced the freckles on my forearm, and whispered to myself that I was proud. This alive, hopeful state was worth every tear, every sleepless hour. I dressed deliberately in jeans and a loose linen blouse, pulling on my favorite suede loafers. The day demanded normalcy, grocery shopping, calling the bank about, updating my accounts, emailing the catering company to cancel our anniversary order. I scribbled a to-do list on a scrap of paper, each line a reminder that I was reclaiming not just my voice, but my agency. As I walked from my living room to the kitchen, the hardwood floors creaked beneath my feet, and I realized I felt at home here for the first time in years. My own home. Mid-morning, I ventured out into the brisk Chicago air. Tulip bulbs were pushing through the soil in the planters along Michigan Avenue, tiny green hopes mirroring my own. I paused at a florist and picked up a small bouquet of daisies. An eucalyptus bright, uncomplicated. I told myself they were for me, a gesture of self-compassion rather than an offering to anyone else. The florist smiled at me, and for a moment, I wondered if she could sense the new solidity in my posture. I paid quietly, tucked the blooms into my tote, and boarded the bus toward the community center where I'd signed up for a standalone workshop. On public relations, sitting in that classroom, pen in hand, I felt the thrill at being just Emily again, no wife of, no event planner's spouse, just a professional woman sharpening her skills. The instructor, a crisp woman in her 40s, spoke about brand identity and storytelling. I scribbled notes, my mind alive with possibilities, freelancing projects, public sector gigs, maybe even launching my own consultancy. Each idea unfurled like a petal, and I realized how much I'd stifled my ambitions under the weight of marital expectations. I closed my notebook with determination and signed up for the next 2 sessions. That evening, Rachel invited me over for dinner. Her apartment on the north side was warm and welcoming, filled with houseplants and the smell of garlic roasting in the oven. We toasted with glasses of red wine and sat at her kitchen island, plates piled with pasta and sautéed kale. "How are you feeling?" she asked, her voice gentle. I paused, lifted my glass, and let the wine slide over my tongue. Then I spoke honestly about the buzz of autonomy, the ache of grief, the knot of anxiety still lodged in my chest. She reached across the counter, squeezed my hand, and we sat in companionable silence. Over the following weeks, life settled into a new rhythm. Mornings at the community centre, afternoons drafting proposals for small businesses, evenings curled up with my favourite novels. I reconnected with old friends. My high school roommate organised a girls' night at a rooftop bar. My cousin invited me to volunteer at an animal shelter. Each connection reminded me that the world extended beyond my apartment walls and my recently vacated marriage. I felt my grit forging anew, tempered by self-care and candid conversations with therapists and mentors. One Saturday afternoon, I decided to drive downtown and visit the Art Institute's Impressionist galleries. I wandered among Monet's water, Lille, Renoir's sunlit figures, and felt a quiet resonance in their brushstrokes, fleeting moments captured, light transcending shadow. I stood before water Lille and let the colours wash over me, thinking of the storm last year in my heart and how, bit by bit, I was learning to float again. A text dinged on my phone. It was from my husband. 4 words. Can we talk? Please. My pulse fluttered, but I set my phone to silent. I realized then that closure wasn't a conversation with him, it was every choice I'd made to honor myself. I had given him space to explain, to apologize, but I didn't need his words to validate my worth. I pocketed my phone and wandered back through the galleries, and when I emerged into the sunlight of Millennium Park, I felt unexpectedly light. The breeze off the lake carried a promise. This city, with its soaring skyline and restless energy, was mine to explore. That night, I placed the daisies from my first morning on my bedside table. Their petals glowed softly under the lamp, a testament to resilience and renewal. I slipped into bed, pulled the covers up, and closed my eyes with a peaceful smile. Tomorrow, I would draft my first pitch for a local startup. Next week, I'd launch my website, and in a few months, I'd look back on this time as the moment I chose myself. Part 3 of my story was not an ending, but a beginning rich with possibility, grounded in truth, and guided by the unwavering conviction that I am worthy of respect, honesty, and love.